Disclaimer: This is a student presentation using a hypothetical scenario for educational purposes. The presenter is a student at UAMS, not a representative of the agency named in the following slides. The information contained herein does not necessarily reflect the views of said agency. Good morning and welcome. My name is Savannah Hickman and I'm a pediatrician on the American Board of Pediatrics. I just wanted to say how wonderful it is to see so many high school students interested in becoming a pediatrician, and I'm really excited to get into our information for today. All right, let's get started. So, as I'm sure you all are aware, when you become a physician, it's really important to be knowledgeable and aware of the most common health risks for your patients, and specifically as pediatricians, of course, you'll be knowledgeable and aware of the common health risks for children. So the field that contributes to research of pediatric disease are expanding exponentially. An example of this would be epidemiology, or the research of diseases and how they spread. These fields are being researched with a lot more vigor and investment than they were previously, because we are now coming to understand that children respond very differently to certain health risks, very differently to certain exposures that we're going to discuss. So these things are really coming to the forefront, and this is something very important for you guys to keep in mind if you are choosing to continue down this career path. So because you're all here for a pediatrics interest meeting, we're probably assuming that most of you are not history buffs, which is totally fine. But one really important thing about history is it shows us where we've been, and it really highlights where we need to go. So as far as the history of children being defined as a special population, this is actually a rather recent development in the history of medicine. It was not until 1996 with the Food Quality Protection Act that really anyone noticed how fundamentally different reactions in children were, their reactions to different exposures that adults had with the same dosages, the same time periods, and it was affecting children a lot more than it was affecting adults. And this led researchers, the medical field, virtually everyone, to finally understand that children's development requires specialized research, because you have to ascertain the difference compared to adults, and this ultimately absolutely changes how you treat them, how you see them, how you interpret an entire encounter with your patients. That being said, obviously, with everything that I've said, this alludes to a big change in the mid-90s, alludes to a lot of things in the future still taking up change, but there are, of course, people who believe that the traditional route is the preferred method. So they like to stick to the same thing that was done prior to that time. And although to a certain degree, of course, you can say it was effective in its own right, to a certain degree, we now have much more research to understand that it should be promoted as its own individualistic thing. Pediatric research should. And a few of the arguments against it really mainly revolve around children's lack of ability to give consent to being part of a research system, but the benefit definitely outweighs the cost in this case, to be able to understand really what the long-term effects are on children, and even short-term serious effects, so that we can better serve them in the medical field and in the public health arena as well. So I mentioned the term special populations, and you guys are probably wondering what that means. And a special population is essentially a group of people who are more vulnerable and susceptible to perhaps disease development or injury in comparison to a healthy adult. So some more examples of special populations would be like pregnant women or the elderly, and I'm sure you guys can all think of examples of this even in your own personal lives. I know a lot of us probably have a grandparent who has fallen or has gotten sick with a cold, and they're unable to get out of bed, whereas when you're young and you're healthy and you're 25, you can just bounce right up and take some Dayquil and be done with it. So it's really important to understand how different factors are affecting different populations and different communities, and specifically here for children, some of their largest risk factors that, again, are impactful for others but may not necessarily impact on the same level are their diet, the social behaviors of their parents, metal exposure such as lead and water, household allergens, and indoor air pollution. So, a few markers about these things. Diet, we hear about diet all the time. We hear about food pyramids, we learn about it when we're young, but when you are small, there have been several studies done. One of the ones by Hulvez et al. Really displayed that consistent exposure to fast food when you're below the age of 5 can have cognitive and behavioral implications, and so can the social behavior of your parents. The more your parents spend time with friends or family, the more likely a child is to be engaged in healthy behaviors and interactions, as well as cognitive displays in school. Metals, I think this is, something that in our lifetime has been on the news a lot. So if you guys have not heard of Flint, Michigan, I really encourage you to go do some research on that because it's a very important current situation that we are still dealing with here in the United States. But essentially, lead exposure is extremely high in their water sources, and it is still an ongoing problem. And unfortunately for children, lead can lead to all sorts of physical and cognitive deficits, and it's really, really important to address things like that. And in the case of household allergens, these are things that you probably wouldn't, put a whole lot of thought investment into, like having your exterminator come whenever the recommended time period is, or dusting as frequently as you think you should. But the truth is that household allergens encompass any sort of air material that doesn't need to be there, that has like landed on the ground and now developed a little bit and is now an allergen, or even bugs. Insects are huge in causing all sorts of diseases and problems, and we don't even realize it. But if, a 1.5-year-old is crawling on the ground and touching the floor all day, then it makes sense that that would be all wrapped up together. And so these things are really important to consider. They're really, really impactful for children, and these are things you guys should really be aware of. And the things that make children more susceptible are the physiological factors. So children are developing. We know this. They're changing all the time, like we've talked about. But because their bodies are developing, so are their systems. So their systems that get rid of things that might be toxic to them are not developed the way healthy adults are. Their systems for absorbing and digesting are just not as advanced as an adult. And so this really puts them at risk for things that aren't necessarily huge risk factors for healthy adults. So there are a lot of ideas floating around about the field of pediatric research and where that needs to be heading in the future. And one of the big things that researchers are talking about, and that's kind of going around in the medical field, the public health arena, and our government, is promoting processes of risk development and risk identification. So one of the big things that has been suggested is, every family every year gets an at-home test to test the level of indoor air pollutants, or that there are more frequent tests done by a designated agency from a state or local government to test water levels and see if they're, for example, are too high of lead levels or anything that might be in the water that could be detrimental to populations, especially children. So working with the current systems we already have, as well as implementing new systems that make risk identification more accessible and releases some of the burden from any one agency or any one specific group of people, is going to be really crucial going forward in the next decade. Another thing that researchers have really been focusing on and really, really, really want to emphasize, and something I really want to emphasize with you guys, is that climate change is impacting everything. There's not a thing that you can think of in your life today that is not being impacted by what we are seeing in climate change. So energy deficiencies, as climate change continues, are trying to be combated with ventilation reuse, which is a good idea in theory. It's a good idea for healthy adults. This is something that would probably work really well on a college campus. But in homes in extreme urban areas, if there are small children at home and it's the filtration system is not great, then children are being re-exposed to indoor air pollutants that may have no effect on their parents, but may have a severe effect on either their cognitive or physical growth or both. And so this is a really important thing to identify and be aware of. And filtration development is being discussed really heavily, as well as pollution aversion, so that children do not have to suffer without clean water or to have to use water that is contaminated in some way. Finally, in the past 2 decades, the world has seen an elevated number of infectious diseases popping up that previously were either undiscovered or didn't exist. And the way that these impact children is very different from adults. It's something to be very, very mindful of and to continue research on, as well as the cropping up of a large number of pediatric chronic illness cases. This is not necessarily applicable to the entire world, but especially in the United States, there's been a huge elevated number. So pediatric diabetes, pediatric problems with blood pressure, anything like that, anything that was previously considered to be, more in respect to adults that is now disproportionately affecting children, is really important to continue research on and to figure out how we can alleviate and mediate some of those factors to ensure that whatever risk factors and exposures are contributing to that, we can minimize and or completely eliminate. So the important question is, where do you guys come in? And I am really happy to say that you guys will have a very large role in the future of pediatric research. So two of the big things are going to be, obviously, this is going to be hammered in your brain. If you're not already aware, I'm telling you first and foremost, before you even start medical school, you are an advocate for your patients. You are not only trying to help them get better and potentially figure out what's wrong with them, what's ailing them, but you are advocating for them. If they need something that maybe somebody else doesn't think they need, but they do, such as like an insurance company might say, oh, that's not relevant, or oh, we don't think that's necessary, and it is because it is somehow relevant to figuring out what's happening to your patient, you are going to advocate for them. That's your job. But another thing that you are advocating for is, and that you need to be advocating for in the future, is going to be your place in pediatric research. Incorporating physician knowledge and personal experience and how you guys have seen risk factors and outcomes in children is going to be crucial for the development of research patterns and for the development of published research, so that we can all improve the field of pediatrics, because the priority here is improving children's health, and that's the bottom line. And when all facets of different fields work together, then we can create something really, really impactful that carries a lot of weight and can really be substantial for the future and for change. And so that's something that is going to be really big for you guys moving forward. Another thing that's going to be huge for you guys is learning and promoting new training styles. So something that I don't know if you guys have seen yet, but I will encourage you to stay up to date with current events, especially as they relate to medicine, because this has been a big conversation in the field of medicine for the past few years. The current textbooks being used at most medical institutions in the form of medical schools are significantly older for some courses and have published research that is no longer applicable, or that wasn't even applicable when they were published. There are a lot of examples of this. I really encourage you to do some personal research on this fact because it is it's honestly slightly alarming, but I'm hopeful that that will be changed by the time you guys are entering medical school. But being open to learning new things in once you get very far into your career, and being open to being told that the way you used to do it or the thing you thought isn't right, and to improve upon and make it better, that is crucial as a physician, and not only as a physician but as a human being. And so promoting new training styles and being receptive to a new wave of learning is going to be really, really important for you guys. And finally, redefining children's health. So before, children's health was really looked at, and health in general was really looked at as an absence of disease, but we now know that children's health is really an all-encompassing thing. It is an emphasis of the happiness, the absence, not only the absence of disease, but social and spiritual, if it so applies, and mental health. Everything is healthy, and the well-being of children is being emphasized and taken care of. And so really living out that definition as a physician and as you take care of them is going to be crucial.